Hello, good evening, boo, etc. I hope every one of you is enjoying this good Easter Sunday. And there are plenty of, I decided I was wanting to actually bundle a lot of Chris's religious posts almost entirely into this specific day because, well, for reasons I want to get into, ladies and gentlemen, and this is something that is affecting Chris as we speak right now, is that Chris is under the delusions that he is Jesus Christ, which I'll get into a little bit more about that because I wanted to talk about that issue very, very individually, on its own. But outside of calling yourself Jesus Christ, which is a can of worms in itself, there is a slightly more pressing issue I wanted to cover. That's the whole Messiah complex. And fortunately enough, there is an article just about this. So, let's get to it. Now, first of all, health disclosure. This article contains in-depth discussion of Chris's physical and or mental health. This page is not to be construed as a substitute for medical advice or a professional diagnosis. All diagnoses are either taken from outside documentation or based on amateur analysis. I do have a job, dipshit. It is literally called being a literal goddess and protecting as many of your sorry hides from the casualties of the dimensional merge in progress. Even though Chris apparently stated that roughly half the Earth's population is going to survive the merge, so that could literally run into the cases of literally every 1 in 2 people. So I don't exactly know how Chris is going to protect people from that. I don't know how he could do that. Also, he can't do that anyway because the dimensional merge is not real. I know I'm going to have to keep bringing this up, ladies and gentlemen, but it's a good way to be reminded of the fact that, you know what, remember, this is the real world and not this imaginary world Chris thinks he lives in, as though he doesn't live in the same reality as us. I have my morals, especially being the full reincarnation of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, and God of all, including you. And by the way, Chris said that while he was sitting in jail on charges of incest. So, consider whether or not you think Jesus Christ is the sort of person you want to follow to as a result of allegations of incest, among other things. So, you know, I know a lot of people don't believe in Jesus Christ, but I would like to imagine that actually some people are fully capable of understanding that Jesus would not have committed incest. I didn't think I would ever have to say that, but here we are. A Messiah complex is the mental state of those who believe they are or will become saviors. Chris started demonstrating symptoms of this type of psychosis alongside his worsening narcissism and increase in maladaptive coping mechanisms. In the later half of the 2010s, Chris increasingly started restoring to his fantasy world as a way of coping with the pressures of reality. And after being influenced by the idea guy's cult-like grip, who utilized a parody series about video game deities to manipulate Chris, he gradually built up a belief that these deities really existed in another dimension, and copied the lore about them to make up an imaginary counterpart of himself with their powers. CPU Blueheart. Chris also attempted without success to orchestrate a dimensional merge, to unite himself with said counterpart to gain an array of godlike powers, also money, because Chris's house was in danger of foreclosure during this time, because of the $6,000 that Chris... I think it was roughly about $6,000 that the idea guys actually extorted from Chris. But it could easily be as much as maybe $10,000 for all we know. At least to this point. As a maladaptive coping mechanism against his bleak life. Following his arrest in August 2021 and subsequent internment, Chris's Messiah complex turned literal. Possibly influenced by the Bibles given to prisoners in jail, Chris began referring to himself as Jesus Christ and God, even signing a letter as Mrs. Jesus Christine Weston Chandler Sonichu, the Goddess Blueheart, and Lord of All. It's going to be a little bit hard getting mail with a name like that. Chris also refers to himself as Real Player One in his prison letters, which can be interpreted as a belief that he is the most important being in existence. If not a sign of full-blown, albeit non-philosophical solipsism, either way, it can be assumed that Chris views the majority of humankind as beneath him, although the most likely he did till well before going completely cuckoo. And in later events where Chris is trying to preach with some orchestrated evidence conjured up by trolls on the Chris Chan subreddit and among other such platforms, that Hasbro was in cahoots with the Russians as to why My Little Pony Generation 5 is was disliked by Chris, I should say. I have no opinions about the show whatsoever. So there's that. The origins of the Messiah complex. Chris's Messiah complex grew out of two already existing problems he had, namely his narcissism and his maladaptive coping mechanisms. One is to neglect Chris's accountability for anything he does, and Chris to justify said unaccountability by creating scenarios and realities where Chris can only be the one to be right. He can never be wrong in that case. Since before his discovery, Chris believed he had magic powers. He used to curse people he didn't like, mostly men, and bless people he did like, mostly women. Due to trolls acting like these curses actually worked, Chris got the confirmation that some of his powers were real. He also thought God and Jesus had a special interest in his life and were appearing in his dreams to help him. That's slightly more, I'd say, more wishful thinking, but I think we've sort of covered a little bit about that ourselves. In his comics, Chris gave himself godlike powers to beat up the people he didn't like and change real-life situations where he was punished by authorities to a situation where he won against the authorities, i.e. a Mary Sue. For a long time, Comic Chris and Real Chris were separate individuals, in Chris's mind. But with the coming of the Idea Guys and the TT Squad, I should also just, before we go any further, the reason why I call it the TT Squad is because somebody did point out to me a couple of weeks ago that this word right here, TROON, this word is actually considered a slur against people who are transgender. Though I don't. Well, this is from what somebody pointed out to me. I don't know if I've gotten like any other information from those people who are actually transgender, but if you know anything at all about these group of individuals, you'll know that they are not maybe the greatest people in the world either, and anyone who wants to be associated with Chris in real life, there's got to be some ulterior motives or something's going on that we're not seeing, as history has shown us, and also why would anyone want to hang out with Chris anyway? That's the point. The line between reality and fiction got blurred, and he mixed himself and his self-insert up. As he had to prove to the fans that his newfound magic powers were real, he came up with the most rational solution he could think of, the dimensional merge. This helped blow his Messiah complex out of proportion. The dimensional merge, and yes, don't worry ladies and gentlemen, there is going to be a full-blown article about this as well, because in terms of things that Chris has conjured up by himself and has literally run havoc over his own life, look no further than Dimensional Merge. It's almost like the second coming of the Sonichu comics about where Chris's descent into infamy like truly began. The merge is a concept where two dimensions, one where Chris is a loser and another where he is a god, are merging, where the end result is a single Chris with godlike powers. The Idea Guys created the concept of the merge, and Chris immediately believed it because it provided an explanation as to why his powers are being activated after 36 years of his miserable existence. This was most likely created as a means of coping from his life, where he was the man of the house and had to take care of his mother, pay bills, and do tasks that he considers to be stressful. He also uses the merge to justify why he does nothing daily and to give himself hope that things might get better in the future. To stroke his ego and get confirmation that his godlike powers are being activated, he made his fictional characters worship him. For him, these characters are living, and their worship is equivalent to worship by actual people. Seeing this, many enablers also started worshipping him and created a religion based on him to get on his good side. Due to all this reaffirmation, in his beliefs, he started thinking he is a god. And Jesus reborn. In the wake of Chris being arrested and incarcerated on a charge of incest, awaiting legal proceedings, viewers watched with bated breath in anticipation of what would happen next. Many thought that time in jail would serve to humble Chris, imparting unto him an inescapable awareness of his wrongdoing and forcing him to understand that actions had consequences. No, that didn't happen. For over a month, there was near-total radio silence, and for a time, people believed that Chris had finally had a reckoning in being forced to face reality. On September 19, 2021, these notions were swiftly put to rest, as Chris added another layer of delusion to the many that grew of his unchecked long-term psychoses. While not the first jail letter written by Chris, that being a brief plea for money in August shortly after his incarceration, the message sent on September 19th was wildly different in both tone and content, reading more like a sermon than a cry for help. Chris declared himself as a reincarnation of Jesus of Nazareth as he defended his actions, and fulminated against those who had betrayed him. Having come to view himself as the single most important being in existence, christening himself, no pun intended, as the real Player One, the effective center of the entire universe, many of the messages that followed sent to assorted acquaintances, old friends, and YouTube channel owners, among others, served to demonstrate the scope of his new outlook. Chris would use letters to elaborate on his feelings towards others, or provide lore for his confusing self-made pantheon, all the while assuring his readers of his godly status and insisting vehemently that the dimensional merge was coming ever closer, nearing completion by his own hands, and insisting with equal vehemence that his actions towards Barb were not criminal, but an act of soul bonding, designed to protect her and prolong her life. Chris's belief in his own godhood became such that he eventually convinced himself that he would simply be released from jail without consequence to tend to his duties, following the completion of the merge, a belief he held right up until his last known communique prior to his transfer, and well after he returned from his court-mandated hospital stay. Many believed that his stay at the mental ward in jail would help with his mental problems, but it wouldn't be the case. On the 3rd of May 2023, a cashier for Earthbound Trading Incorporated has shown Chris's receipt, on which he signed himself as J. Christ Chan Sonichu. Ever since then, recent developments appear to prove that Chris's religious fervour has only intensified. On the 16th of October, on the day of the Second Coming, very subtle there, Chris, he returned to the online world in an earnest with a rambling, directionless mixture of song parodies and incoherent babbling, in which he trotted out yet more vague and nonsensical terminology that only hints at the continued erosion of his mental state. This carried over into his next address, wherein he directly referred to himself once again as the reincarnation of Jesus and the one avatar of all existence, implying that he was given divine full knowledge of the incest leaks, attributing his arrest to divine intervention, and once more claiming innocence by saying he was incarcerated thanks to the actions of other entirely unrelated people. Over the next several months, he continued to refer to himself as Jesus Christ Weston Chandler Sonichu Prime, renamed the Christian Love Day to Spiritual Love Day, and blessed people for money on live streams. And for some reason, people decided to give Chris money. Don't do this, ladies and gentlemen. That's just my preference. How this dramatic change in his mindset occurred is uncertain, though it is commonly believed that combined with Chris's existing fascination with the dimensional merge and an inability to cope with the consequences of his actions, Chris's voracious readings of the Bible in isolation has served to instill within him a deep religious fervour, driving him to create a nonsensical mythology that he has since used as yet another coping mechanism, one that threatens to completely destroy what tenuous ties to reality he still has left. It also serves as a logical next step to Chris's delusions of godhood, given that Chris already treated himself as a messiah of his fantasy world. He simply added a reincarnation element to it, and joined a list of many other delusional people who believe that they are Jesus of Nazareth reincarnated. It appears as if the only thing keeping him from a mental institution is his autism, which he claimed to have cured with his godly powers. And finally, examples of his Messiah complex. Phrases such as, "Oh my, Chris Chan," and "Chris Chan Sonichu is watching over you," replacing the word God with his nickname. Asked people to try and pray for him multiple times. Has said he looks over others' lives to make sure no bad happens to them, though one person he was looking over did get divorced. Womp frigging womp, Chris. Claims to make sure many people don't die of diseases. I don't know exactly how he could have done that. I've probably done more to save people. No, again, I know I've brought this up before, ladies and gentlemen, but, I was working throughout the pandemic, specifically to make sure people did not catch COVID-19, and to make sure people didn't die from COVID. I've done more to save the people's lives from diseases than Chris has done. What on earth is Chris talking about? Believing that he is straight up Jesus Christ of Nazareth reincarnated. So, shit, yeah. Now, to be honest, that is kind of it for now, because the reason why I wanted to bring this whole issue about of a Messiah complex up is that, well, yes, demonstrating his megalomania. You should check out the song, by the way, Megalomania by Black Sabbath. It's literally one of the greatest songs they've ever done. But again, to sort of just give you my overall feelings about what Chris's Messiah complex comes across as, it's just about the only thing Chris has to suggest that maybe he was not the one who was actually in the wrong about anything he's done. Which, again, now listen, even before all of these things happened, is that people already didn't particularly like Chris and didn't really want to have anything to do with Chris, and that Chris is not a representation of certain communities, like, you know, people with autism, or people who like My Little Pony, or people who are transgender or part of the LGBTQ plus community. But it's even the sort of thing that even detract people from actually wanting to make sure that Chris is like safe, or people forgive him and stuff like that, because this all comes across as the only way, or one of the only ways, in which Chris could be forbidden from the idea that he would have to accept that these things have like taken place. And these are the only things that, again, if people were not paying attention to Chris, this probably wouldn't have happened anyway. So what exactly is the right way to like conclude this video? Is it the idea? Well, first of all, do not pray to Chris. Chris is not a god. Secondly, if you really believe Chris is the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, he isn't. And third, one can only wonder exactly how long this charade is going to last before Chris either gets bored of it and simply says he's stopped being Jesus Christ, or whether or not it's just people get so bored with it that Chris decides that, well, the dog has had its day, you could say. Bear in mind, Chris spent a large part of 2020 claiming to be Sonichu, the original prime of the species, and this was done just because. And again, but nobody was bothering to like pay any attention to this, because a lot of people just saw Chris, by the increased popularity of the Geno Samuel documentary series, that they just saw Chris as just attention seeking, and that because there's absolutely nothing else he could actually offer to society, then he may as well establish an entire society of his own, which he had pretty much been doing for years at that point, except, well, through out of sense of worship and pray. But I pray to God that this sort of thing just ends and Chris just decides, well, that's it, and buggers off somewhere else. Or who knows, he might even be going back to jail. We know, okay, now, with that being said, it's, unless Chris actually does anything to suggest the idea of him going back to jail, that's one thing. But it will also be worth noting about if Chris does go back to jail again, and surely, again, even in the eyes of the courts, the jails, they'll know exactly who Chris is, and they know a little bit more about, well, whether you want to, how much influence do you think people will be like, well, the police or the law will take an interest in this is a multitude of issues. For the fact that, for the starter, the quickie is a Wikipedia-style entry means that, which, to my knowledge, people have the ability to change at will, so the police could easily accuse the actual validity of the things that the article is written in relation to Chris. But what about the other things that can't be faked? The things that, again, Gino Samuel points out. So, well, what's the case here, ladies and gentlemen, is that how are you going to get through the mind of somebody who has decided not to listen? And that's basically the thing with Chris is, and pretty much the whole point of this entire Messiah complex and the dimensional merge is that Chris refuses to listen. He refuses to listen to what people have said, that he's in the wrong for what he's done. And, well, what do you make of that? Not very much, you may possibly say, but people haven't had much nice things to say about Chris for years. Do you think Chris will actually, pay attention to these things? Or is it just safe to say that, well, it is what it is, and we'll just wait and see when the next stupid thing Chris does is. So, there you go. And with all that being said and done, I hope all of you guys have enjoyed this, and I'll see all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.